In this video, we are just going to be wrapping up the front side of our Chapter 7 toolkit by adding the remaining definitions and properties that we have not yet completed. Now, if your teacher has you go through the lessons and problems where you break down some of these shapes and prove some of these other properties we have not yet written, that's great. But this video, we're just going to write them down so you can have that completed. Let's start off with the remaining trapezoids, since that's where we left off on problem 7-105. So a trapezoid here, a quadrilateral with one pair of parallel sides, has a special property with its angles. So if those sides are parallel, what can I say about that pair of angles? Also, that pair of angles. Think for a moment. Hopefully you identified that because those sides are parallel, those are supplementary, same side interior or consecutive interior angles. So let's add that below to our properties. If a shape is a trapezoid, then it has two pairs of consecutive supplementary angles. Great. So what about the isosceles trapezoid? Well, before we add that, we also need to add some vocabulary for the parts of any trapezoid. So the parallel sides of a trapezoid are called the bases. So we have base 1 and base 2. And then the non-parallel sides are called legs. So an isosceles trapezoid, let's go ahead and define that, is a trapezoid with congruent legs. So if those legs are congruent, and it is a trapezoid, and by the definition of a trapezoid, it has one pair of parallel sides. If you completed problem 7-106, you saw that this was essentially a section of an isosceles triangle. And so if it's an isosceles triangle, those base angles are congruent. But in this case, since it's a trapezoid, and these two angles are congruent, and these two angles are supplementary, both these angles are supplementary to the same angle, and they're both congruent, which means these two angles are also congruent. And since a trapezoid doesn't only have one base, it has two, we're going to call both of those base angles. So if a shape is an isosceles trapezoid, it has two pairs of congruent base angles. I want you to now draw the diagonals of this trapezoid. If you have a ruler or a straight edge, that will really help make nice, clean line segments, and it will help you investigate what we're going to do next. Okay, once you draw those, with your ruler, I want you to measure out the different segments created by the intersection. So we have two diagonals, but since they intersect, you can really break it into 4 different segments. So if you want to explore and measure those, hit pause and then play when you've identified anything that's true about them. So hopefully you were able to see that when they intersect, they create two pairs of congruent segments. And the diagonals themselves are congruent. So in our properties, we're going to write diagonals are congruent. And that's it for our trapezoids. Moving on to the rhombus and the square. One property of a rhombus that we saw when we were doing one of our proofs, but we didn't specify in its properties, is the fact that the diagonals split opposite angles into congruent angles. And so they essentially cut it in half, and the word for that is, do you remember? Bisect. So diagonals bisect the angles. And since it is a parallelogram, then we already know that opposite angles are congruent. But in a rhombus, not only are they congruent, but they get bisected by the diagonals. So now we know all the properties of a rhombus. Moving on to a square. A square is essentially just a combination of two different shapes. Can you identify which two shapes meet the definition of a square? Well, if we look at our shapes toolkit, a square is a quadrilateral with 4 right angles and 4 sides of equal length. Well, if it's a quadrilateral with 4 right angles, that means it is a rectangle. And since it has 4 sides of equal length, that means it is a rhombus. So if a shape is a square, it is a rectangle and a rhombus, meaning it has all the properties of both shapes. So what we do now is we just add all the properties of a rectangle and a rhombus to our shape. So let's start by adding its own definition, 4 right angles and 4 congruent sides. All right, since it is a rectangle and a rhombus, it is also a parallelogram, so opposite sides are parallel. See if you can pause the video and add all the other markings to the diagonals that must be true because it is a rectangle and a rhombus. All right. So because it's a rectangle, we know that diagonals are congruent. And since it's a parallelogram, they bisect each other. So all four of those segments are the same. And since it's a rhombus, we know that they are perpendicular bisectors of each other. We know that they also bisect the angles. So all of these angles are congruent. Now think about, what must those angles be? If it bisects a 90-degree angle, each of those angles must be 45 degrees. So all of those angles are 45 degrees. So there you have the properties of a square and everything else on this Quadrilaterals toolkit for Chapter 7.